Well, my background is a little bit different than some of the other colleagues of my time. I was born in Oakland, California, and my grandfather happened to have been a houseboy. At the time, he was trapped in California because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. He couldn't leave for fear of not being able to come back, kind of similar to our immigration policy today with our president. And he couldn't bring his family over. So he did what a lot of Chinese American men did. He became a houseboy, which is going into a family, usually a Caucasian family, raising the children, doing the cooking, the cleaning, taking care of the household. And he did that so well that the owner of the house, who was with the Levi Strauss family, is one of the presidents or vice presidents, told him that he was going to give him an exclusive franchise to sell the Levi label to a family that was rather in need of economic adjustment. And so, sight unseen, my grandfather moved two families to Honolulu, Hawaii. And at a very young age, I landed in Hawaii, and my father found out quickly that selling Levi jeans in a temperature that was very humid and hot was not that successful. And so the Levi part of the business had to terminate. My parents became kind of itinerant garment workers. And I actually learned how to sew at the age of 7 and cut materials from cloth. And so my background was very, very much closely linked to my parents' garment business. And I was kind of an at-risk child. I ended up being bullied a lot. I don't know why. I'm 6'3" and I weigh 300 pounds, but I was bullied a lot. And I was also had eye problems. I couldn't see the blackboard, and I did very poorly. I had one of the lowest testing for verbal reasoning, less than 40%. And so I began to cut class, and my parents were very alarmed. I got heavily involved in the church, and also I was forced to join a organization called the Key Club. It's the youth version of the Kiwanis Club. And we started to do a lot of projects such as cleaning toilets in churches, cleaning cigarette butts off of the beaches of beautiful Honolulu, Hawaii, and the surrounding area. And I began to find value in focusing on the needs of other people rather than myself. And so that kind of ended up, I went to Kalani High School, I went to the University of Hawaii, and got a bachelor's and a master's degree, and then came to California. I was born in Oakland, California in 1946, and I moved to Honolulu, Hawaii probably within 1947 or 1948. I was very young when I moved from California to Hawaii, but I found out that all of my other classmates actually had also, many of their backgrounds were very immigrant, coming from all over the world. At the time, Hawaii was a plantation economy, recovering plantation economy, making the transition to a non-plantation economy. And I grew up with people whose parents and grandparents came from Portugal, from Japan, from China, came from the Philippines, from Korea. And it was quite a diverse background of other students that I grew up with. But it was a little different because not too many people had come from California.
Well, for all intents and purposes, you were almost like a Hawaii born.
Yes, I was, but I was kind of an outsider. I was kind of kept to myself and liked to read a lot. And so I really didn't kind of fit in to the local life, although I was very, very involved in. What saved me was being involved in writing. I started writing articles for the school paper, and I actually was the youth editor for the Honolulu Advertiser youth page. At the time, they had a one page devoted to youth, and so I got to interview young people, and that gave me a lot of idea of what I wanted to become, because a lot of these young people were involved in a lot of great projects in their communities, and I thought that was really wonderful. I then became the associate editor of the newspaper at Kalani High School, and then learned the value of hard work, because we were always up against a deadline, and we would work till 2 or 3 in the morning, and that's when I learned that I was really kind of a night person anyway. But I love to write, and I think that later on informed me when I went to UCLA that of the value of articles that are from the heart and reflect the values of the community. Yes, my identity as a person and as an Asian American really started with my parents. My father had served in World War II, and he came back to San Francisco that was completely hostile to him. He couldn't find housing. I remember that once when he couldn't find housing, he put on his World War II Army uniform, and he went to this beautiful house, and the woman took one look at him and said, "Who are you? You know, go back to China," and threw some garbage on him from the 2nd floor, and really kind of made an impression on me. And but he never developed any hatred. He said that what you have to do is work hard and study, and you will eventually find out that you're better than that. And I think that was very, very important to me. And my father worked very, very hard with my mother. My mother actually was a person that figured out that I was kind of ending up being a lost soul. She was riding home one day on the bus, and she was crying, and this complete stranger asked her why she was crying. She said, "I'm losing my son." And so she was led to this church, and I ended up for the next few years going to church 2 or 3 times a day, and that kind of focused me on the need for to have a spiritual value, and also considered going to seminary. My brother, who did go to seminary, went to Fuller Seminary in Pasadena and became a pastor, a very progressive pastor, someone that had great compassion, and he was actually the pastor of a well-known elected official in Hawaii named Patsy Mink. And so he learned a lot from her life, and we'd often talk about that as well. So my oldest sister died of liver failure from hepatitis that she'd contracted, and that really had a big impression on me, because how could this happen? I ended up working in an emergency room for 3 years at Kaiser Hospital, very to save money for law school. The hospital's now was sold and is now the site of a beautiful hotel in Honolulu, Hawaii, in Ala Moana. But working in the emergency room had a great impact on me. It was the first time that I saw people that didn't have health care. Half of the people couldn't afford the emergency room fee, but at the time was $12 or $13. I remember a young girl that had been brought in one night, and I still remember many decades later, and she was bleeding and had almost died, and the doctor turned to her and said, you know, did you know that you were almost dying? And she was evidently pregnant, 16-year-old girl, the daughter of plantation workers. And she said to him in a voice that I'll never forget and a face that I'll never forget, she says, "Sir, you're the first doctor I've ever met. I don't know anything about that." And I thought, you know, this is really something that affected me deeply, and that's why the idea of health care for all is such an important thing to me, because I've seen people that were near death or actually passed away because of the lack of preventive health care, and so that was another experience that really had a profound effect on me. When I went to the University of Hawaii, I was surprised that I got accepted. I almost failed high school. I almost didn't live to see graduation. And so here I was in an environment that I was not prepared for, and I actually hoped just to survive and get out. I had to work virtually almost full or part-time, in my family's garment business. And so I didn't have much time to study. So I got a lot of D's in my first year, but then I finally got serious and decided to work much harder. The thing that I was exposed to at a very early part in the University of Hawaii was the presence of a lot of the Native Hawaiians who were actually quite disadvantaged in terms of trying to crack the academic code, which I, of course, was not very successful at myself, and started to visit some of the Native Hawaiian communities because of the need to have some context for my education. My education started to be, well, if I can just make it, it became a personal thing, then I've overcome because I was able to graduate. But later on it began to shift to, well, who does education serve? You were lucky that you made it this far, and what are you going to do with that? And so that had a profound effect on me. I later on ended up visiting and actually representing, when I was a law student, one of the Native Hawaiian communities over water rights. And they were the site of a massive development that had come in, and basically were going to eat up all the water and take up a lot of the land, and the local residents were up in arms. And so I was challenged with this question, which is, you have education, you can speak well, why don't you use that for the community? And I ended up going to the public hearings on that development and representing the interests of a lot of the people that wanted me to speak for them and with them, because I wasn't the only one. And so that had a profound effect on me when I was at the University of Hawaii as well. I also worked at the organization called the East-West Center. The East-West Center, I worked at the switchboard, and I came into contact with a lot of the aspiring world leaders that would come there for training. And that kind of gave me a global view of the world, rather than growing up in a small island where in 1 hour you could drive and that would be it. That would be the extent of your whole life. And I began developing a view that maybe that we, coming from a small spot in the universe, can somehow interact with people in other countries. And that kind of made me want to know more about other countries, other third world countries especially. We had a lot of people from the third world countries that were there to get an education, and they were actually on their way to becoming the future presidents, elected officials, premiers, et cetera, in charge of infrastructure. And so I had many discussions with them, since I controlled the switchboard and the mail, and they would come by and I would have discussions with them. So that was a very, very important part that gave me some context, if you will, a world view on the life of someone who was only knowledgeable about a very, very small island, which is just a dot in the Pacific Ocean.
So you, what did you major in as an undergrad? And you said you went to graduate school at the University of Hawaii. Can you tell me about those degrees and
Yes, I was.
Your development of your ideas, not just in school, but in school at that political time.
Yes, after 2 years of college, I was at a crossroads, because I wanted to become a journalism major because I love to write, and I love to interview people. I love to hear about their stories. I love to hear about their challenges and how they overcame them. My parents told me, however, that if I became a journalism major, I would probably starve to death. So they asked me to consider going to political science, since they thought I argued a lot and maybe I could make a living as a lawyer. So I became a political science major. And then in order to, and I thought that that would be a natural pathway to go to law school. And I was introduced to a law firm that represented the ILWU, the International Longshore Workers Union in Hawaii. And I began going to their meetings, and I began seeing that my skills as an attorney would possibly be able to serve a very large number of people in Hawaii, people that helped build Hawaii, that served on the plantations, and now we're making the transition into the trade unions and into politics. And so that broadened my idea into the idea of service to a particular section of our community. And so I ended up thinking I would go to law school and major in labor law, but I didn't have the money. And so I began to look for a full-time job. And I found a full-time job at a local hospital. And I remember I went in for an interview at 3 o'clock, and they said, well, can you start at 12 midnight? Because they had an opening in the medical records section. And so for 6 months I worked in the medical records, and they had an opening in the emergency room, and so I went to the emergency room and Ford. But remember, I would start the medical records at midnight, and then at 8 o'clock in the morning I would get ready for my first class at the University of Hawaii, working my master's degree in American Studies, because I just thought that that was something I was interested in. I wanted to know how to become a true American. So I studied American Studies and got my master's degree. It took me 3 years, and I became a teaching assistant for a very progressive professor, and he taught a course called Man and Women in the City, and it was about the city life. And so we were forced to look at the city, the local downtown area that was poor, homeless, people from the LGBT community, struggling merchants, immigrants starting their first restaurant. And we began to do tours, and we began to focus people whose eyes maybe had seen the suburbs and the beaches and the tourist part of Hawaii, which is great. It's a great tourist location as well as other spots in the universe. But what they wanted us to do, what we wanted our students to do, was to look at the city, the growth of the city, the infrastructure, the housing, the transportation, the jobs, the economy, the trade unions. And so we hired a bus, and once a week I would do a tour of the city, and I really enjoyed doing that because I had to learn about the city. And we'd stop once in a while and interview people that were living on the streets or not far from it. And so then at that point I began to think that maybe I should, I got my master's degree, and then I thought, well, what now? And I began to look for some union jobs because I was interested in working for a union. And but at the same time, my parents kept asking me, well, you are going to apply for law school, aren't you? And so I made some perfunctory applications. I think I got rejected by everybody. But I was put on the waiting list of one school in particular, and I think it was on a Thursday afternoon I got a phone call. And my father, who I remember, who was lying on his back because of back pain from lifting so many heavy jeans, asked me to get the phone, and they said it's UCLA, and they had sent a letter, and they wanted to know how come I didn't respond to it, and it actually had arrived that, I guess it took the slow boat over, and they said, we're ready to give it to the next spot. We have plenty of people. We know you probably have made plans. I guess maybe they were hoping that I would reject it because I was on the waiting list. I said, no, I'm going to be there. And I made that decision that changed my life, and I arrived at UCLA literally 4 days later in my flip-flops and my shorts and my Zoris. And it was like 50 degrees at the LAX. I was like, what? So that's how I landed, and I was not able to get a position in the graduate dorm. I got assigned to the undergraduate dorm at UCLA called Hedrick Hall, which I think I experienced some of the best parties of my life when I would come home from the library. So that's how I landed on UCLA's campus.
Wow. Campus?
Yes, well, when I landed at UCLA, I remember I'm in a small island that took an hour, and I land on a campus that took an hour to get around, and so that was kind of like what happened. I was, first of all, very shocked that I had been accepted. Remember, I was the at-risk child that could barely get out of the 10th grade, and now I'm at UCLA, and one of the top law schools in the nation. And so I felt very alienated from the rest of the campus. People seemed to have places to go to, and friends they had. I had nobody. I knew no one there. One day, one of the law students named Stuart Quo asked me a question. He said, why are you spending so much time in the library? I said, because that's where the law is. I'm studying the law. He says, you won't find the law in the library. You'll find it in the community. And so he took me to Chinatown, Los Angeles. At the time, it was under a heavy, quote-unquote, anti-gang task force by the LAPD. And I remember my first experience was I was ordered out of the car and I was face down on the dirt. And at that location were a number of people that were starting to serve the community's interests from UCLA, and they happened to be at the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA. So when I went back, I said, what is this Asian American Studies Center at UCLA? I met people like Lowell Chun-Hoon, who himself had just come from Hawaii and was, I believe, working on the Amerasia Journal. I met people like Franklin Odo, Elsie Uematsu, and her daughters, Mary. And I read something that was really amazing. It was called Roots, an Asian American Reader. And as I began to read that, I almost had tears in my eyes. I said, this is really answering a lot of the questions that I had, which is, who am I? There must be nobody on earth like me. And I found out that there, which is an Asian American, trying to navigate between the immigrant world and the world of society, between our ethnicity and an ethnicity that I thought society had pretty much wanted us to erase. And I took American Studies because I wanted to become more American and less Hawaiian, less Chinese, less immigrant. And here it was that if you wanted to know about who you were, then you have to look at the roots of how America developed, colonizing other people and themselves coming here as many times as refugees or fleeing something that America possibly had something to do with. Not in every case, but in some cases. And so I began to read, I began to want to know who were the people that were writing these amazing articles. And so I met people like Cass Tolentino, who was another law student who was very active in the Filipino American community, Buck Wong, who was active in Chinatown, Stuart Kuo, who was actually part of the student movement for ethnic studies on campus. And they began to give me a context for why I was in law school. And I began to spend every waking hour in Campbell Hall. So if I had a half an hour break, I would run to Campbell Hall and eat a sandwich. And that night, if I had nowhere to go, we would go to Kentucky Fried Chicken in Westwood Village and bring our dinner back, and we would spend the whole night talking about politics, Asian American politics, and what we would do. And so gradually I began to see that I wasn't going to law school. I wasn't at UCLA to study law. I was at UCLA to get a first-hand lesson about the rest of my life, which is, how do you figure out the political system? How do you have social change? How do you make a difference? You know, how do you appreciate the past so that you can change the future? And how can you live in the present? And so that began to be a life-changing moment for me. And I began to read more and more and talk to more and more people. And so I ended up deciding at that point that the reason I'm in law school is to really serve the community. So Stuart Kuo, who is a civil rights icon, began asking students from all over Southern California if they would help form the first Asian law collective in America, in addition to what was happening in San Francisco, the Asian Law Caucus, to devote our legal skills to serving the community. And what we did was we opened up a community clinic in Chinatown, and we would start volunteering there. And this is all because of UCLA Asian American Studies Center. In other words, we had to go to a studies center at UCLA, but we found out that wasn't the end of our destination. That was just the beginning, because the whole purpose of going to UCLA, of being involved in the Asian American Studies Center, is to send us out back into the community, unless you're going to have another academic career, which is just as good. And so, as a result of that, the very first, we began selling all of our books, and we saved a princely sum of $12,000 when we opened up our first law office. It was called a community law office, the Asian Law Collective, and it was located guess where? On Temple Street. And so if you're going west on Temple Street and you pass by the amazing cathedral on the right-hand side, and you will, within 2 blocks, you'll see the Bossier area where the LA Unified School District is. You'll see Vertiel's, which is a towing company, and then you'll see Darling's Flowers. And we, a bunch of us, decided after seeing like 30 or 40 locations, we decided to have our office there because it was very cheap and it was in the community. And we found out why it was cheap because I think we took our lease in June when it was in the middle of the summer. But we found out why it was so cheap. It was in October, all the rain came and we found out the floors were not concrete, they were mud. But we began serving the needs of the poor in the Temple Bossier area. And it ended up that a large priority of their needs were immigration needs. And so I became kind of like the resident immigration lawyer for that area. So that's kind of like the context for what happened.
Did you do that while you were a UCLA student or after you graduated?
This is after I graduated from the law school that we did this. But one of the things that the UCLA Asian American Studies Center taught me was the dichotomy between what I learned about in law school and what I learned about at Campbell Hall. See, in law school, I read a lot of quote-unquote cases. We read a lot of civil rights cases, and they were very important, particularly about African Americans and their struggle for civil rights, their movement from slavery into civil society and trying to wrestle with what it means. And yet, I saw nothing about Asian Americans. And yet, when I would go to Campbell Hall, there'd be all these amazing articles and stories about the Exclusion Act, about the camps Japanese Americans faced, about the Korematsu case. I read none of these in law school. So I, of course, unfortunately opened my big mouth in Campbell Hall. And I said, how come there, and they said, how come there's nothing about our history in civil rights? And so someone, it was Alan Morimoto, who said, well, why don't you get off your butt and why don't you teach a class about that? So I think I turned red, white, and blue, and I began to say something like, well, there's no textbook on it. They said, well, why don't you go on and make a copy of all the articles we have and put them into your textbook. So then I said, well, maybe nobody will come. And they said, well, put up or shut up. Well, we're going to create a class. So we formed the first class in America called Asian Americans and the Law. And I cobbled together about 200 pages of Xerox pages. In those days, you know, we had carbon and the beginning of the Xerox machine. That's how long ago it was. And we had to hand put together our own textbooks. We made textbooks for 25 people. I said, you know, I don't know what we're going to do with the rest of these extra copies when nobody comes. Well, on the first day of class, we had 250 people. And we had no place to put them. So I went back to Campbell Hall. I said, we have a crisis. He says, no, we got plenty of rooms here. And so we began developing sections. And that class grew from 250 to I think 500 or more. And it became the first class in America on Asian Americans and the law. These were, what we do, we take legal cases that were just mind-blowing. There was a case in San Francisco of the Asian American, the Chinese American who witnessed a murder. But the judge would not allow this person to testify because on the books it said that the Mongoloid race did not have legal status to speak in a legal proceeding. They had the equivalency of an animal, of a dog. Dogs can't testify, neither can Asians. Or the case about the Chinese that own laundries in San Francisco. And they passed a law saying that from this day forward, there shall be no laundries made out of wood. Well, there are a lot of businesses made out of wood. They said it's a fire hazard. They had no fire from any laundry in 50 years. The Chinese Exclusion Act. the internment cases affecting Japanese Americans during World War II. We began, and the students would read these cases and they would start crying. And they would say, we didn't know this existed. Or the case of the largest mass lynching in the history of America. I remember in class I said, class, do you know where the largest case of people fashioning rope and putting them around the head and stringing them up and choking them until they died? Where did the largest mass lynching occur? Well, they all mentioned Mississippi, Alabama. I just know it was Chinatown, USA, Los Angeles, California. 2 blocks from the federal building, was the largest mass lynching in America. And and they were shocked. And this is our history, not just in America, but in our own backyards. And this is why the need to go into those communities. Or the labor struggles that took place at Apayani village with the Filipino American community, and every different ethnic community, or how the Hawaiians were legally disenfranchised of their land through a series of legal cases. And and because the legal case was just the starting point. All this started because of my little trip from Honolulu, Hawaii to Los Angeles LAX airport to Westwood Village to Hedrick Hall to Campbell Hall. And by the way, that class, Asian American Law, is still taught at most of the major universities, even to this day. Nobuya actually took that case and taught it at his campus as well. And it's one of the few cases that is still taught, that started it at many, many years ago. Many of those classes, of course, have been absorbed into the prevailing culture, but there's still a need for it because they still don't have those darn cases in our law books at the major law schools or any law school.
What year was that first class, and did you co-teach?
The class was right after I graduated from UCLA Law School. See, after I graduated from UCLA Law School, I still came back to Campbell Hall. It's like a pigeon. You always know where to go home when you're in trouble. And so we actually started the class, I think in the idea for the class started when I was at UCLA between 71 and 74 when we graduated. So it took many, many years of fermentation and convincing of looking, but it actually became the first class taught, I think, in 1976, between 1976 and 1977. And it's still taught today. I think Stuart Quoll, teaches the current class. If you can imagine a class that started in the 70s that was fashioned out of individual pages that were Xeroxed, standing at the Xerox machine and making, 25 copies just for one page of the reader, that then spread to all the different campuses and is still taught today to undergraduates. Not a class for law students, it's a class for undergraduates that want to learn about history and the importance of the court system as a last goal line stance for justice in many cases.
So it seemed like you were learning at the same time you were teaching, right?
I'm still learning, and I have a learning disability, which is I can't learn by thinking. I have to learn by doing, by acting, by asking. I ask a lot of questions because growing up I was very quiet. I had a lot of questions that were all in my mind. And I think what UCLA Asian American Studies Center taught us is that they threw a lot of questions at us, but they also demanded the answers. The problem in many of our school systems is that there's a lot of answers provided by rote memory, but there are very few answers that are provided by requiring you to act out the solution. And I think we learn when we're part of the answer rather than being part of the question. And I think that changed the whole dynamic that started in my experience at the Asian American UCLA Studies Center, the UCLA Asian American Studies Center, which is that everyone there was held accountable. It wasn't what are you doing here, it's what are you doing there at the same time. You're not justifying your existence by the academic setting. You're justifying your existence by the community setting, and I think that's very, very, or by both. And that's not to say there's nothing wrong with research, but I think that anyone that's doing research knows that they have to go into the community to really find out the real research. And I took those values with me when I became in my political career later on.
Was in Los Angeles already. He had a house in the Rampart district near Tommy's Hamburger. And so we lived in one of the rooms in his home, and my uncle and his 5 children lived in the other room, and then my grandfather was there as well, and until we could all kind of get on our feet. And that was a very typical way in which, you know, immigrants transition. My father was actually a U.S. citizen. My grandfather was an international student, and so at Berkeley, and so my father and his brother were born in Berkeley. But he grew up in China, and so when he tried to claim his U.S. citizenship by birthright, they denied him, and he had to get an attorney to fight for his citizenship. But he was able to get it, and that's how we were able to come to the U.S. So I was 2 at the time. We lived with my grandfather for 7 years, and so I had a chance to, you know, experience as the youngest of 3 daughters in an immigrant family home, you know, LA, and a neighborhood. But I will say that my parents, and I think my mother in particular, was not entirely comfortable, you know, in what was still a strange environment for her. And so I grew up, and because we were 3 girls, in a very protective environment. We didn't sleep over at other people's houses. They didn't come over to play. And so it was fairly sheltered. And eventually, my father did get a job that took him to the Bay Area, and we all moved, and that was the first time we left our grandfather's house. And we went, he worked in San Francisco, so we lived in Berkeley and in Richmond and for a while. And eventually my father, who was well educated, he also was an international student at one time, and he got his master's in economics from Stanford. So he was interested in banking, and so he began the first Chinese American bank in Los Angeles, which is Cathay Bank. So, but it took quite a lot. He was denied a lot of opportunity when he worked for American banks. And so seeing my parents struggle made a very big impression on me. But they were raised in a Chinese environment, and where they were the majority for the most part, even though Hong Kong was colonized, and they also had that experience. But in growing up, there were times when I felt we were slighted, and I didn't understand why. And my father would just sort of blow it off, and said, "Oh, those people are just stupid." And he could say that, I think, because he grew up as a majority. And I couldn't feel it because I never grew up as a majority. And when those things happened, I always wondered, did we do something wrong? You know, something wrong with us? And so I had different wonderings in growing up than my parents did. And they were not able to put those into context in a way that I could understand or felt was real for me. So,
Do you have any examples of?
You know, we didn't have a lot of money growing up, and so our vacations were mainly road trips into California, Yosemite, or other, you know, public places. And so I remember one summer and that we were driving through Central California, and we stopped at a little coffee shop to eat, and we sat down, and they wouldn't come to our table. And eventually we realized they weren't going to serve us. And so, you know, it was one of those times my father just said, "Oh, these people are stupid," and we left. But I do think about, you know, how it might have felt for him in front of his family. And so there were many moments of disrespect that I saw they had to endure because of who they are, because they spoke with an accent. Both my parents did speak English, but not their preference, but they did speak English. So it left a powerful impression on me. And when I got to UCLA, I really, honestly, I was 17 and I didn't even know what I was going to college for. I just knew I had to go. And I had to go as a girl and as the youngest. I had to go to to university, someplace within driving distance. I couldn't go away to school. We didn't have that kind of money, but also they were very protective. And so, so luckily, in LA we have a few choices, and I went to UCLA, commuted for the first year, and I really wanted to live outside my family home. I really wanted some independence. So I actually worked at the student store, and I saved my money. And in those days, you could save enough money to get an apartment. And after the first year, I told my dad I was going to move out, and I had my own money to do it. And he was quite unhappy about it, but I said I would continue to go to school if he paid the tuition. So, so that's what I did. And I moved into my own apartment with a high school friend, and I was just thrilled to be kind of out on my own, because I really felt that my parents' view of the world was so different than mine, and more restricted, at least I thought, than mine. And I wanted to explore for myself what was true for myself.
Can you tell me what year you came onto campus?
I came in the fall of 1967, right after high school. So at the time, the cutoff age was, my birthday's in November, so the cutoff age was later, so I was 17 when I graduated from high school and came to UCLA. So really had no clue. And I started as an English major because I did well in English in high school. And I took my first English class at UCLA, and I thought, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? I can't do this, So I changed to anthropology, which I thought was very fascinating, but I didn't know what I would do with it. And then I ended with a degree in psychology. So it took me a little while.
Can you just, do you remember what prompted your transition to anthropology and then to psychology?
Anthropology interested me, I think, in retrospect, because it talked about culture. And my parents, I was clearly, at least at that time, bicultural. I was not multicultural yet. And my parents, while I think to some degree they were anchored in Chinese culture. And I think they didn't see that. And I was a little bit more straddled. And so anthropology in my view at the time, was about straddling cultures and observing them. And I thought that would give me some answers. You know, I had many questions. And eventually, I thought of psychology as, you know, really, it is about the culture, but it is about individuals and how they deal with it. And I think many people whom I've talked to who at that time went into psychology, it's really about me. I want to figure that out, you know. And so, not that it gave me all those answers, but it was sufficiently interesting for me to finish. Barely, I must say, because, you know, the civil rights movement, the women's movement was going on at the time, and it was so much more interesting than the classroom. And so I cut many classes, but I was really comforted when I got to college by the fact my parents would never have to see a report card of mine if I didn't show them. So, so I barely graduated, I must say, but I had a great time.
Can you recall some of the social and political, can you describe the social and political environment of the nation during that time and how it felt to be at UCLA, given that?
There was, the civil rights movement was well underway. There was the Vietnam War. There were many things going on at the time that in the student communities, you know, it didn't seem right. And for me, coming out of my sheltered environment, it really, I feel very grateful for that time because it opened my mind to ideas and possibilities instead of just keeping my head down. You know, that there was an encouragement to step out, to speak out, to think independently. And I think I was thinking somewhat independently, but clearly my family training was, you think what you like, but you don't say anything. You say what we, you know, prescribe that is said, or you behave in the way we prescribe to behave. And so this opened the door for much more. And I think the civil rights movement in particular, although it was particularly framed with black and white, and a little bit with, you know, black and brown and white, it didn't really include Asians, even though Asians were very intimately involved in some of the core work of the civil rights movement. We weren't really part of the narrative. And, but to hear the narrative for other people of color, I began to...
The world at that time?
My parents' view of the world is that China is at the center of the world, Chinese culture is at the center of the world, and anyone who doesn't think so, you know, is just ignorant. And so they were very grounded and confident about where they were grounded. And I was not grounded, you know, because I was in two cultures. They were clear about who they were. They were Chinese. I was not Chinese in the way that they were. And I could never be. So what was I? And then to redefine then that I am hyphenated and that's okay, and that other people are like me. And there's a place. We didn't know what the place, I didn't know what the place was, but I knew there was a place for me. And I wasn't just outside. And I was outside of Chinese culture, and I was outside of American culture. So where was my place in the world?
And how did the civil rights movement then resonate with that?
I realized, even though the narrative was mainly black and white, that there were other people who were experiencing that otherness, that outside of everything, and trying to find a legitimate place. And as a non-African American, looking at African Americans, I could see they have a place, but I couldn't see my own place because there was not a narrative for Asian Americans at the time. But to know that I could see a place for people who felt outside of everything, that there might be a place for me. And that it did spark a lot of discussion among Asian Americans on campus who had some similar feeling about that there was a place and we had to define it.
This is a great transition to the kinds of things you got involved in at UCLA. I know you mentioned Oriental Concern and Chinese awareness. Can you give us kind of maybe start with like an overview of what organizations you found or founded or
I'm not sure I can be as linear as all that, but
no, you don't have to be linear, that's okay.
But among the friends I made, we all were challenged, sort of our values, our kind of moral compass, our perspectives, our social justice perspective was being formed. And there was a lot of discussion about that among us, in the midst of just being college students and, growing up in the normal ways. That was very much, began to be somewhat the center of social life, and eventually, so my memory is not as clear. I remember the Are You Curious Yellow conference. I did not remember it being at UCLA, but I remember we had a piece of, a small piece of that, this group of friends of mine to present something. And frankly, I was so absorbed in thinking about that at the time that I didn't remember that much about the overall conference. But that was a culminating point of, we were meeting and then we did something. So that was the something, one of the early somethings that we did. The other part of what...
Can you talk more about that?
And I, in retrospect, 50 years later, it was like we were very naive, and we created a skit. We thought that was something that I needed to do, and I wanted to do, but it was a difficult thing. And I think that the years, those years in the context of civil rights and women's movement, really challenged me, and I think many others, to do things that we were not trained to do, we're not used to doing, we were told we shouldn't do, and yet we knew we had to do. So constant challenge of stepping out, of being more of who you could be, of getting courage, So those are some of the internal things I remember. Perhaps sadly more than some of the external things. But I remember there were women's groups, Asian American women's groups, study groups that I went to. I was part of. Mia Iwataki was part of some of those, and talking about about women's roles, reflecting on it, having a place to talk about it, and especially with coming from a family of daughters, and as the youngest daughter. I had always grown up thinking that, that I was, as the youngest of 3 daughters, that I was the last chance to have a boy. And I didn't turn out to be a boy, so I felt I had to be my father's son. So in many ways, I played that out in the family to some degree. My father had a master's, so I better get a master's, and but my father was a banker, and over time he was able to, you know, to fulfill his dream. And so I had to be in nonprofits, you know. My bit of rebellion continues. So, but, you know, in terms of other things being more interesting than class at UCLA, you know, in trying to define who we were as Asian Americans, I spent a lot of time in Chinatown. And there were groups of students who were in Chinatown from different universities, you know, trying to do the same thing. And we formed a group under a few different titles, and we gathered at the Chinatown Teen Post for a while. We began a community newspaper called Chinese Awareness that we produced out of the Gidra office and used the Gidra equipment to do. They were good enough to, you know, let us go in there, and we would, you know, hand it out in the community. Those who could speak Chinese well enough would go into the sewing factories and try to organize, or what we thought was organizing. I'm not sure we really knew what we were doing at all, but people who were there became involved in different things like Yellow Brotherhood. Judy Chu was there in Yellow Brotherhood. Mike Ng, before they, you know, were a couple, was there with Stuart Quo and, you know, many others who were at the reunion, May and Rocky. And all of us were just individuals at the time trying to figure it out for the Chinese portion of it. The Chinatown was important to me because it reflected my parents' experience, and I needed to be connected to that. And it was still part of my experience. But those of us who were students, we had our other foot that could navigate outside of Chinatown because we had language, we had education, we had cultural understanding of the American side. So when you are a bridge in that way, then there's some obligation. There's a place for a bridge. Even when I was executive director at Chinatown Service Center, I was not Chinese enough for some. You know, I didn't speak enough, I didn't read, I didn't, you know, and so forth. But that never bothered me because I understood what my role needed to be. So I could reach farther into City Hall than they could, even though I couldn't reach as far as they thought, you know, that all of us were still blocked. But if I could, then that was what I needed to do. So to continue to push in, make roads for everybody. And I think those values came from those times at UCLA. And, you know, while I didn't have a direct hand in forming, I think, Asian American Studies, Asian American Studies became really important because it legitimized our experience, as I'm sure many have said. But in having Campbell Hall to hang out in and, you know, having a place where we belonged was really important to then solidify those values and then carry them out into the world. Ultimately, you know, UCLA was a short period in my life, a 4-year period, an impactful period, but still relatively short. And to carry that then out into the world and what I did, I think is the enduring impact of it.
That's beautifully said. I'd like to know a little more about Chinese awareness because no one else has really talked about Chinese awareness. So can you tell us a little more about?
I wish I had kept some copies. It was not as cool or slick as Ghidra, I'll tell you that. We didn't have the artistry of that. It was, but there were many late nights that I was at the Ghidra office doing the IBM Composer machine that, I don't know if any of you know what that is, but it's like a typewriter, but you have to type the line twice. And the first time it will do something to understand the justification of, of the margins, and then you type it the second time and it'll justify paste onto your layout. And so Chinese Awareness tried to give Chinese news, Chinatown news, and ideas of what the community could be and where there might, as we saw, were inequities. And part of going into the sewing factories, my Chinese is not good enough to have done that. I went with people who had the language facility, but is to talk about to people who were desperate to be able to make a living for their family, who felt lucky that they could work for almost nothing and hours and sacrifice so much for very little wage. They felt lucky to have that, to tell them this is not how you should be treated. This is not how other people are treated, and that you have a right to something better. Try to educate in that way. So we tried to put that into Chinese Awareness. There were people in our group who were fluent and could read and write Chinese, and so we had a Chinese version, part of it, and an English version. I, of course, could only work on the English version. And then we had some people who would take pictures, and we'd have photographs. And so that was the basic kind of format of what we did. And we put it out once a month, and we handed it out free to people. I cannot really remember how long it lasted. It seemed like it was a couple of years. And we would talk about these small things, like sometimes when you hand it out free, people don't value it, and they think, I don't want to take it. And then we thought, well, should we charge like 10 cents or, make it, seem valuable to people if they had to pay for it so they would read it. So we went through a number of those things, but we, eventually, because it was a college time and people were moving, we ran out of people, and ended up to be only 3 people, and then it was just too much to be done. But we were appreciative that Ghidra, saw that we were trying to do something and allowed us to use the equipment and gave us access to the office and so forth. We didn't have the means at all.
But I'm sure you gained a lot from that experience. What did you think you took away from that experience?
It's hard now to distinguish the retrospective and the actual learning. But I think as students, I think I saw that there were things that we could do. And it might not have been the actual things we did. But in organizing together, I think there were lessons about we can do more together, and that there are like-minded people. And when you think of who was there in those days, Judy Chu, Mike Ng, Stuart Kuo, May and Rocky, and they all, in a sense, we all went on to incorporate those values in different ways, in how we chose to manifest those values, in elected office, in law, in nonprofits. But it was a place where we grew our moral values and our social justice values together.
Can you describe a little bit more about how would you articulate what those values were that kind of crystallized during that time?
It was I think there was a keener awareness of injustice that in some ways the immigrant generation says, okay, you know, yes, we don't understand the culture well. Yes, we don't speak English well. So of course they're going to treat us differently. That's natural. They sort of accept that, and we came to understand that is not natural. That is not all right. People deserve the same as other people, even though they look different, they speak differently, they have different, you know, practices and traditions, and we have to fight for that. And fighting was not something my parents said, you go do that, you know. But knowing that other people were also, you know, that you speak up, you fight for what you believe is right, that people deserve equal treatment, that there is a promise in this country, and that it really is up to us to keep that promise. And where we keep that, you know, where we ensure that is in the places we know best, which is the immigrant community. So we fight for that, we work for that. And along the way, when we see other injustices for other people, then we also have to stand up for that. So I think those were some of, when you look at Judy's work, or Mike's work in immigration law, and then as an elected, Stuart's work in advancing justice, they reflect those values. And it, you know, it came at an important time.
Thank you. Just one more question about UCLA. You mentioned you were involved in Oriental Concern.
Mm-hmm.
Does that have any relationship to Chinese awareness, or was that kind of separate? And what can you remember about Oriental Concern?
Oriental Concern was, as I remember it, was more around UCLA students. Chinese awareness, you know, drew from the region. There were people who came from Cal State and as well, and even some from USC and so forth. Different people came together at Chinatown. In fact, you know, we welcomed people who came, and there was one young man, young now because I'm quite old, but he was our peer, and he came and he helped out, and later we found out he was a police informant, you know, checking us out. So, so it was very open. But Oriental Concern, as I remember, was mostly UCLA, and it was a lot of Japanese Americans. And I think as a Chinese American at that time at UCLA, it felt to me, maybe it's not technically accurate, but it felt to me as though the Asian American movement was dominated by Japanese. And they were the larger population. Chinese had not had the huge immigration yet. And I didn't meet my first Korean until I was 19, and I never had Japanese food until I was 20. So, you know, so I wasn't quite multicultural yet. It was very limited diversity in terms of Asian Americans. I knew maybe one Filipino, you know. But when I felt when people were talking about the Asian American movement here in Los Angeles, they were really talking about Japanese, and they didn't really see the Chinese. And so, so I think in part that drew me back to Chinatown. So there was some dominant groups, you know, that also then dominated some of the narrative for Asian American movement, at least here. And I'm sure in San Francisco it was more of a Chinese narrative, but in LA it was more, in my view, of a Japanese narrative.
What about, you said the women's
Mhm.
liberation movement also
Mhm.
was an influence on you, and was that, how did you, what was it that was attractive to you?
Well, one of the things that I didn't mention was when we were at UCLA at the Asian American Studies Center, there was a program in Chinatown to do childcare almost every weekend for the parents that had to go shopping, and these were the Chinatown Little Friends group that I thought was very important because UCLA, of course, being in Westwood Village, is a long way from a lot of the community, the little Tokyo, of Filipino town, of Koreatown, of Chinatown. So that was really important because it started to force us out of that Westwood-centric identity into going to the community on a regular basis. So just about every weekend we could sign up and do a shift out there. It was really good, and I met other people from UCLA like Buck Wong and Mei Chen and Rocky Chen and a number of other people who went on to do amazing things in their lives. So the child care was important, and I think focusing us on having an identity that was beyond this masculinity, what men need to do, does not involve child care idea, which is important, but I think it was also putting us in touch with a lot of people that, as you look back many years later, we all got our start in that little group, and a lot of people ended up doing things I think they're very important to me, and I really respect them for that. So I think that's pretty an amazing moment that started out at the time, which is most of what we go through in life. It looked like just, this Saturday morning I'll just spend 3 or 4 hours at Castelar Elementary School in Chinatown, and then seemingly being a blur, and then now many years later looking back and saying, yeah, that was one of those moments because we needed to get out of our comfort zone, and we needed to define community as other than where we study and get our grades from. Yeah, it's funny that I've often been asked the question of, number one, why did politics and getting elected to office come so late in the quote-unquote movement? And the answer is very simple and yet complex. The idea is that as we look at the tools that we use for social change to affect injustice, to bring about equality, at various times we've always included some and excluded others, and being in law and politics, those were two tools that people came to the table very late to think could be effective. And now look at the fight to keep abortion rights alive. It's going to be in the court system. So I look at the issue of culture as extremely important, and I look at any social movement, I look at any political movement, I look at even the way that legal decisions are handed down. They're not in a vacuum. They're in what we call the culture of the community. And what is the culture of the community? What are the things that affect us either consciously or most of the time unconsciously? Well, it's our music, it's our films, it's what we read, it's how we'll quote entertained, what we do in the hours that we're not working from 9 to 5. And if you think about that, that's an amazing potential that is unused. It's just like looking at a vegetable and saying, I'm going to eat only this part because that's nutritious, and then looking at the other parts and throwing them away, and they end up after some nutritional analysis as that was the best part of the plant. And I believe that in my personal life I've been greatly affected by films. I try to see a movie at least once a week, at least going to one, and obviously more. And so I think that anyone that's involved in filmmaking, if you think at what's moved us, if you think about what's moved us from a nation of immigrants to a nation of we hate immigrants to now a nation of, well, let's start thinking about that. It's because of the culture shifted and the stories of immigrants, the stories of women. How did the Me Too movement arise? It didn't arise because some law was passed that thou shalt be fair to women. That was always there. It was really because of the stories that came out through the media, through popular culture, through documentary films. If you think about R. Kelly, and how for many years, I'm not trying to prejudge him, how for many years that there were stories about sexual abuse involving minors as well. And again, not to prejudge him. Innocent until proven guilty. I'm a lawyer, I know that. But how did that move to the point where he was finally arrested and indicted in many cases? It was because that very, very powerful documentary, docudrama, whatever you want to call it. But so I'd say to any young person or any person of any age that if you have a tool that you're passionate about, then there's probably 1 million people that are passionate about seeing your tool. And your obligation isn't to yourself, because you already know what makes you excited or passionate about. You can't change that. Either you like this food or you hate it, or you like doing this or you don't. That's already there. But what your obligation is to the millions of people out there, they're going to miss seeing the product of your wonderful creation. And that's what has to drive you. Because when we turn inward, the culture's always taught us, we're no good, it's not your time. When my wife decided to run for Congress, a leading elected official that's nationally known told her, Judy, it's not your time. Your people have not yet paid their dues. And you know what happens when someone says that? You run right at them and you blow them away. And there are these thousands of little voices saying, it's not your time, it's not your place, you're not ready, you're not this, you're not that. When I go and talk to young people, I always tell them that it's funny because I bet you've been told more things about why you shouldn't be doing this than you are why you should. I'm too young, I'm too old. I'm too thin, I'm too fat. I'm too tall, I'm too short. My ethnic group, my look, my hair, my clothes, it's not yet ripe. We're blowing that away, and we're doing that because of the powerful documentary, the docudramas, the media, social media, all of that is part of our culture. So anyway, what I say to that is you run straight at them. You go get them. Because all of the voices that told me why I shouldn't be here today, if I had listened to those voices, and they started from within, they're like a cancer. But I think it's more if you look at what the people outside of me need. How do we change what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, particularly in the executive branch? That's not going to come from a change by changing the laws. The laws are there. It's going to come when people rise up. And your story about rising up is going to inspire other people to rise up too. And before you know it, you're going to be marching with one person and then a dozen people. And just like that class that we thought that nobody would come to, Asian Americans in the law, you're going to be with a very, very crowded room. And many years from now, we're going to give you an award. Because right now, the people that control the awards, they're not giving people like you are, but that doesn't mean you're not important. It just means that your award is still being crafted, and you're going to step up to receive it very soon. Yeah, I've been also asked, Mike, you deal with a lot of people with great challenges, and how do you respond? And I said, well, you know, I asked the question of my parents many times. Every time I had a challenge, I was suicidal, depressed, rejected by classmates, not able to find employment, never saw myself graduating from school and then other schools, and being bullied and picked on. I remember every time they'd have a softball game, they'd, I was always the one, they would pick everybody, and then I would go sit under the tree because we don't have enough catcher's mitts, and there were plenty of catcher's mitts. And I asked my parents, I said, why me? Why was I given this body, given this face, given this horrible image I have of myself? And I never had an answer to that. And then I went into the emergency room and I saw the suffering. And my father answered the question about, I don't know when it was, maybe it was about a month before he passed away. He said something very profound. He said that, Mike, there's two kinds of emotions that people have. They have sympathy and they have empathy. Sympathy is, oh, poor you, you got a problem, I've read about it. Empathy is, you know what, I feel for you. I've been there. Let me hug you. Let me comfort you. And that's sometimes why we face those challenges. So that the next time someone comes to us with the same kind of need that we had to felt in our deep, dark past, we can put our arms around them and say, brother, sister, young or old, I've been there before. I have empathy for you. Welcome home, your family.